I loved winter camping. The quiet isolation of the woods, the crisp, cold air, it always felt peaceful. That evening, I arrived at my usual spot, a secluded overlook deep in the forest. It was late, and the sun was already sinking behind the trees. I set up my small campsite, gathered some firewood, and wandered to the cliffside to watch the sunset. That's when I saw it, a fire. Down below in the trees not far from my camp, a bright flame flickered between the trunks. But something was off. There was no tent, no people, no movement, just a fire burning alone in the middle of nowhere. I watched the fire flicker between the trees, my breath curling in the cold air. Someone had to be down there, right? No one just leaves a fire burning in the middle of the woods. But there was no movement. I stood there for a while, expecting to hear voices or footsteps crunching through the snow, anything to confirm that someone was tending the flames. Nothing. The longer I watched, the more unsettled I felt. Was it a trap? Some kind of signal? My instincts screamed at me to leave it alone. I should have listened. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and started making my way down the hill. I moved slowly down the hill, my boots crunching in the snow. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. There were no footprints around the fire, no logs, no chairs, no gear, just the flames licking at the cold night air. I hesitated a few feet away, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Then, I saw something. A figure standing just beyond the fire, barely visible in the flickering glow. They were completely still, facing me. And worst of all, they had no face. I froze. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still. Its faceless head tilted slightly, as if it were listening. My flashlight flickered. I took a slow, cautious step backward. The figure took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat. The fire crackled between us, casting shifting shadows across the snow. Then I realized something that made my stomach drop. The fire wasn't casting a shadow behind the figure. It was like it wasn't even there. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Not from the figure in front of me, from behind. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. The snow was deep, slowing my steps, but I forced my way up the hill, my breath coming in panicked gasps. As I reached my camp, I risked one last look over my shoulder. The fire was gone, like it had never been there. But the shadows were moving. I worked as a park ranger in a national forest known for its harsh winters. Snowstorms could roll in unexpectedly, turning peaceful trails into deadly traps. One evening, as the last light of the sun faded, I received a report that a lone hiker hadn't returned. The temperature was dropping fast. If they were still out there, they wouldn't last the night. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and rifle and set out onto the snow-covered trail. For nearly an hour, I followed faint footprints, barely visible under the fresh snowfall. Then suddenly, the footprints stopped. No signs of turning back, no struggling, just gone. I stood there staring at the abruptly ending footprints. No drag marks, no signs of a struggle. It was like the hiker had vanished into thin air. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, calling out. No answer. The only sound was the wind whistling through the branches, carrying flakes of fresh snow. Then, in the distance, I saw something. A dark shape standing between the trees. Not moving, not responding, just watching me. I swallowed hard, keeping my flashlight trained on the figure. It was too far to make out details, but I could feel it staring back at me. I called out, my voice cracking in the cold. "Hey, are you okay?" No response, no movement. I took a hesitant step forward, and it took a step back, but not like a person would. It was too smooth, too unnatural. Then the radio at my hip crackled to life. A voice, distorted by static, whispered two words. Not alone. I froze, gripping my radio so hard my knuckles turned white. The figure was still moving away, but it wasn't walking. It was gliding, its feet never touching the snow. The voice on the radio crackled again. "Behind you!" My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head, my flashlight trembling in my grip, and I saw them. Not one, not two, but dozens. Figures standing among the trees, their bodies long and unnatural, their faces empty, and they were all facing me. I couldn't breathe. The figures stood completely still, their faceless heads tilted slightly as if they were listening. The radio crackled one last time. "Run!" I didn't hesitate. I bolted through the snow, my boots sinking with every step. The wind howled through the trees, but behind it, I heard something worse. Footsteps, not just one set, dozens, chasing me. I reached the ranger station minutes later, barely able to think. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking too much to grab my radio. When I finally dared to look outside, the trees were empty. But just before sunrise, as I sat there unable to sleep, I noticed something. The fresh snow outside my door. It was covered in footprints. I grew up in a small mountain town where winter storms could bury houses overnight. One year, when I was 12, a blizzard rolled in unexpectedly, cutting off power and covering the roads in thick snowdrifts. My parents had gone into town for supplies, leaving me with my older brother, Jake. By nightfall, the storm had gotten worse. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and thick snow piled against the door. Then, just before midnight, we heard it. A knock. Faint, hollow, coming from the front door, but when we looked outside, there were no footprints in the snow. Jake and I stared at the door, listening. Knock, knock, knock. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls. The storm was too strong for anyone to be out there. And yet, someone was knocking. Jake grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the door. I grabbed his arm. "Don't open it." He hesitated, then slowly peeked through the peephole. His entire body went rigid. I whispered, "What do you see?" His voice was barely audible. "There's nothing there." But the knocking kept going. Then, the back door rattled. I spun around, my heart hammering. Something was circling the house. We ran to the kitchen window, but the snow was falling too thick to see anything. Then, for just a moment, a shape appeared in the blizzard. Tall, too tall. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and when it moved, it didn't walk, it twitched. Jake yanked me away from the window. "Don't look at it," he whispered. The knocking started again, faster, louder. But this time it came from every door, every window. A scraping noise dragged along the walls like something was testing them. Then, a single whisper. "Let me in." The voice at the door changed. It sounded exactly like Mom. "It's me, sweetheart. Let me in." My chest tightened. Jake and I stared at each other. Our parents were still in town. The thing was mimicking her, and it was getting smarter. The power suddenly cut out, plunging us into darkness. Then, from the window, something grinned at us through the frost. We bolted upstairs, locking the bedroom door behind us. The wind screamed outside, but beneath it we could still hear it. The thing scraping against the walls. Then, silence. Minutes passed. An hour. Then, a thud. Something landed on the roof. Jake grabbed my hand, his voice shaking. "It's inside." We spent the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. By morning, the storm had stopped. When we finally found the courage to go downstairs, the house was untouched. No footprints, no claw marks, just the wind howling through the trees. But when our parents returned later that day, my mom frowned. "Why did you unlock the back door?" We never told her what happened. But some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear it. Knocking. Waiting. I used to love solo hiking in the winter. There was something peaceful about the world being covered in snow, the silence stretching for miles. One January, I planned a 2-day hike through the mountains. I had my gear, extra supplies, and a mapped-out route. Everything was fine until the snowstorm hit. The trail vanished beneath the snowfall, and soon I realized I was lost. The sun was setting fast, and my GPS was dead from the cold. That's when I saw it. A small wooden cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, and a faint light flickered from inside. Relief flooded me. I wasn't alone. I hurried toward it, leaving deep footprints in the untouched snow. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. Then, as I reached for the handle, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the cabin was warm. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, and an old wooden rocking chair sat facing it. But something felt wrong. The cabin was dusty, untouched for years, except for the fire. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. I should have left right then, but I was cold, exhausted, and I told myself, maybe the owner just stepped out. I sat by the fire, warming my hands. That's when I noticed the framed photographs on the mantel. Old black and white portraits, faces frozen in time, expressionless, staring. Then I saw it. One of the portraits was of me. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down my spine. I stood up, my breath shaking. This wasn't possible. I had never been here before. Then, crunch, footsteps, outside. I turned to the window, heart pounding. Through the swirling snow, I saw them. Figures standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching. I grabbed my bag, my body screaming at me to run. Then I heard it. The rocking chair behind me. It had started to move. I lunged for the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The wind howled outside, but beneath it, I heard something else. A whisper. It was coming from inside the cabin. I turned, slowly. The portraits had changed. All the faces were now looking at me. The whispering grew louder. Then, from the dark corner of the cabin, something stepped forward. I don't remember leaving. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the snow, miles from where I had last been. The cabin? Gone. No footprints, no smoke, no sign it was ever there. I hiked back to town in a daze, half frozen, trying to make sense of it. Days later, I told an old local what had happened. He just stared at me, his face pale. "You're not the first," he whispered. I demanded answers, but he only shook his head. The cabin only appears when it wants to, and not everyone who finds it comes back. I don't hike alone anymore. And if you ever get lost in the snow and see a cabin where there shouldn't be one, don't go inside. Winters in my town were brutal, the kind that froze lakes solid and buried roads under feet of snow. But for my uncle, winter meant one thing: ice fishing. Every year, he'd take his gear and set up on the same frozen lake, just outside of town. One night, a storm rolled in, and he never came home. The next morning, a search party found his abandoned fishing shack standing alone on the ice. Inside, his coat and fishing rod were still there, but the hole in the ice where he had been fishing was much larger than it should have been, like something had come up and taken him. Days later, I went with my dad to collect my uncle's things. The shack was silent, the wind howling over the ice. The hole in the ice was even bigger now. Dad muttered, "He must have fallen in." But something felt off. I stepped inside the shack, my boots creaking on the frozen boards. The walls were covered in deep scratches, like he had been trying to claw his way out. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the hole in the ice, back inside. A sharp gust of wind rattled the shack. Dad called me back to the truck, but before I left, I glanced into the fishing hole. The ice was crystal clear. I could see deep into the frozen water below, and that's when I saw it. A face, not my uncle's, not human, just staring up at me, smiling. I stumbled back, nearly falling onto the ice. Dad grabbed my arm. "What's wrong?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the hole. But when he looked, there was nothing there. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing that thing under the ice. Then, just past midnight, I woke up to a sound, a knock. It was coming from the window. I pulled the covers over my head, heart hammering. Then, from outside, a voice. "It's cold out here. Let me in." I recognized it instantly. It was my uncle, but my uncle was gone. I stayed under the blankets, too terrified to move. The knocking stopped. But when I finally peeked out the window, I saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading from the lake to my window. And the worst part? There were no footprints leading back. I don't go near frozen lakes anymore, because sometimes things don't stay buried beneath the ice. They come back. A few years ago, I was driving through the mountains when a blizzard hit fast. The snow piled up so quickly I could barely see the road. I was hours from the nearest town when I spotted a small, old-fashioned hotel nestled between the trees. The sign read, "The Blackwood Inn, Vacancy." I had never heard of it before. But with the storm getting worse, I had no choice. I pulled in, parked, and stepped inside. The lobby was warm, the fireplace crackling. The man at the front desk smiled. "Welcome. You're just in time." That's when I noticed something strange. The guest book on the counter. The last entry was from 1954. The man handed me a key and directed me to my room. The hotel was too quiet. No guests, no staff, just the crackling of the fireplace. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed something else. The doors to the other rooms were all slightly open, like someone had just peeked out and left them that way. I told myself it was nothing. I locked my door and got into bed. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, stopping right outside my door. I held my breath. Whoever was in the hallway just stood there. Then, my doorknob turned. I jumped up and flipped on the light. Silence. The footsteps were gone. I cracked the door open, peering into the hallway. Empty, but something felt different. Then I noticed it. The door at the very end of the hallway hadn't been there before. My heart pounded. The door was slightly open. From inside, I heard a whisper. Not words, just something moving. I stepped back, slammed my own door shut, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the storm had cleared. I grabbed my bag and rushed to the lobby. The front desk was empty. The fireplace, cold. Everything looked abandoned, like no one had been here for decades. I ran outside. My car was gone, buried under the snow, like it had been there for years. I hiked through the snow until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a trucker. When I told him I had stayed at the Blackwood Inn, he went pale. That hotel burned down in 1954. No one stayed there since. I turned to look back at the mountain. There was nothing there. No building, no driveway. Just a stretch of untouched snow. I don't know what happened that night, but if you ever see an old hotel in the middle of a storm, keep driving. Last winter, I was driving home late at night on a deserted highway. The snow was falling so hard I could barely see past my headlights. Then, up ahead, I spotted a figure standing on the side of the road. A woman in a long coat, her hair covered in snow. She wasn't waving for help. She just stood there, motionless, staring into the woods. Something about her unnerved me. But the roads were deadly in this weather. I couldn't just leave her out here. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Do you need a ride?" She turned slowly and looked at me. Her face was pale, her eyes too wide. Then, without a word, she got into the back seat. The second she got in, the air in my car felt colder. She didn't buckle her seatbelt, didn't say a single word. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was staring straight ahead. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. I turned back to the road, my hands gripping the wheel. Something was wrong. I tried making conversation. "Are you from around here?" No response. Then, after a long silence, she whispered something. So quiet, I almost didn't hear it. "You're going the wrong way." My stomach dropped. "What?" She didn't respond. But when I looked in the mirror, she was gone. I slammed the brakes, my heart hammering. I turned around. The back seat was empty. The door had never opened. Snow covered the floor of my car, but where she had been sitting, there were no footprints. Then, a pair of headlights appeared behind me. A car was coming up the road fast. I barely managed to swerve onto the shoulder before it sped past. A black sedan, just like mine, only there was someone in the back seat, and they were staring right at me. Shaken, I drove straight home. I told my dad what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off, but his face went pale. "People see her every winter," he said. "A woman standing in the snow, trying to get home." I asked him what happens if you don't stop. He wouldn't answer. "I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. And if you're ever driving alone in a snowstorm and see a woman standing in the cold, keep driving, because she's already in the back seat." Last year, I took a winter job as a caretaker for a remote mountain lodge. The owners only used it in the summer, so I was alone for 3 months. I didn't mind the solitude. The snow was beautiful, and the cabin had enough supplies to last the season. Then, one night, the radio picked up a signal, a voice, crackling through the static. "It's coming." I grabbed the radio. "Hello? Who is this?" The static hissed. Then, one last whisper. "Don't look outside." A gust of wind rattled the cabin. I walked to the frosted window and wiped away the condensation. At first, I saw nothing but swirling snow. Then, a shadow moved between the trees. Tall. Too tall. It wasn't walking. It was gliding. I stumbled backward, my breath fogging in the cold air. Then, it turned toward me. I bolted the door and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't believe what I saw. It had to be a trick of the snow. After a few minutes, I forced myself to look outside again. The shadow was gone. But something was worse. The snow was untouched. There were no footprints. I stayed awake all night listening. For hours, nothing. Then, a sound, scratching, slow and deliberate. It was right outside the door. The wind howled, but under it I heard it again. A low, distorted voice. "Let me in." I never opened the door. When the sun finally rose, the scratching stopped. I grabbed my rifle and cautiously stepped outside. The snow was deep, untouched. No footprints. No signs that anything had been there. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something. Half buried in the snow, at the edge of the tree line. 2 black eyes staring up at me. Frozen. Unblinking. Waiting. A few years ago, my friends and I went on a winter road trip through the mountains. One night, a storm forced us to take a detour. A narrow road through a long, frozen tunnel. It looked abandoned, covered in layers of ice, but our GPS said it was a shortcut. Halfway through, our headlights flickered. That's when we saw them. Handprints, hundreds of them, covering the frozen walls. Some were tiny, others too big to be human. My friend slowed down, gripping the wheel. The deeper we drove, the colder it got. Frost crept across the inside of the windows, then a crack. The ice beneath our tires split. The car lurched, sliding sideways. The engine cut out, and from somewhere deep in the tunnel, we heard breathing. We sat paralyzed, listening. The breathing was slow, deep, like something huge was just under the ice. Then, a thud. The car shook. Something knocked from beneath us, and again, harder. Then the ice started cracking more. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it at the ground, and I saw them, faces, dozens of them, frozen just beneath the ice, their mouths open in silent screams. My friend threw the car into reverse, but the wheels only spun. The tunnel was too slick. Then the breathing stopped, and something whispered from under us. "Stay." We didn't stay. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward. As we sped toward the exit, the ice shattered behind us. We didn't look back. We didn't stop until we reached town. Later, we told a local gas station clerk what happened. His face went pale. "That tunnel collapsed years ago," he said. "No one's driven through it since." I don't know what we went through that night, but when we checked the car the next morning, there were handprints on the windows, from the inside. When I was a kid, my grandfather told me about a town that vanished in the winter of 1936. It was a small village in the mountains, cut off from the world when the heavy snows came. One year, a trading party arrived at the village and found it empty. Fires were still burning in fireplaces. Tables were set for dinner, but there were no people, just footprints in the snow, leading into the woods, and never coming back. Years later, when I was 20, I went hiking near where the town had been. I knew the stories, but I didn't believe them. Then, as the sun began to set, I saw them. Figures, scattered through the trees. At first, I thought they were statues, tall, thin, their faces hidden by ice. But as I got closer, I saw they weren't statues. They were people, frozen, standing upright in the snow. I stepped closer, heart pounding. Their eyes were open. Their skin was pale and frostbitten. I reached out to touch one, and their lips moved. A whisper, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Run!" I stumbled back, my breath fogging in the air. That's when I heard it, a low, distant creaking, like ice shifting. And then I saw them. Beyond the frozen figures deep in the trees, eyes, too many of them, watching, waiting. And then, the frozen people turned toward me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I looked back only once. The figures were gone. The forest was silent. But when I got home that night, my jacket was damp. Frost crusted the fabric. And deep in the folds of the fabric, I found a fingerprint. A cold, blue fingerprint. Like something had touched me and tried to bring me back.